Everybody. Really happy to be joining with Jess Fanzo, now in Rome, but from Johns Hopkins University. So I'm Will Masters from Tufts, and have done this week on Module 6 for the class on rural development for poverty alleviation. As you know, the module, takes us through the development of a rural economy, how it links to cities, how rural areas themselves change, and change in particular through sustainable agriculture, agriculture that uses land, natural resources in an environmentally responsible way to turn moisture, rainfall, water, as well as soil resources into the food that people need and the livelihoods that people can use to transform their lives with education, often migration, often investment in a whole range of goods. And this really hinges in some profound ways on nutrition, on the diets of poor people that enable them to achieve their full potential in life. So I'm super happy to be able to talk right now. We'll talk together about an hour with Jess Fanzo about how rural poverty alleviation and sustainable agriculture relates to nutrition and the development of the whole person. So Jess, I think we'll talk, you and I, for about 20 or 25 minutes, and then we'll be able to have questions in our chat box from folks on the line. So as you're listening in, watching us, please do type in your chat box questions, observations, things that you think might be useful to share. I'm particularly interested in anecdotes about your own experience working in the context, the organizations, the places where you've encountered some of the challenges we'll be talking about, and also questions you might have for us about our experience in places where you have been working. So let me start by asking Jess, why is nutrition central to your life? Like, why do you work so? I mean, you are a champion of food systems, of understanding how nutrition in a big sense matters for human development. You're traveling around the world, you're present all over social media, as well as the scientific literature, contributing in many, many ways to the conversation around these questions. Why have you put this at the center of your professional agenda?
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Will. It's really fun to do this with you. As you know, before I answer your question, as you know, Will is a trained economist, and I call him a trained nutrition economist because he's really come to nutrition and has become a thought leader in the whole nutrition community. And we need great minds outside of those that are trained technically in nutrition, people coming from economics, and agriculture, and geography, and international development. So people like Will are really essential to the whole global nutrition architecture and the conversation and contributing fantastic science. So it's always great to work and see Will and interact with him. He has such a great mind and brings so much to the nutrition conversation. For me, you know, I'm really boring. I've been doing all my degrees were in nutrition, Will, and I don't, you know, why? I don't know. I mean, I guess I was always, I love food. I'm a little bit chunky to show for it. No, but I think, I mean, for me, it's so central to everything. You know, the food, the kind of foods we decide to eat at the end of the day, whether or not we have the choice to eat certain foods. To me, it's so central to everything. You can map food to almost every aspect of our lives: culture, economics, religion, social interactions. I mean, food is always there. But at the same time, there's grand challenges around ensuring that we have enough food for everyone to eat, that food is safe, it's healthy, it's affordable. And so while it's something that seems so central to all aspects of our lives, it has so many challenges associated with and inequities associated with it. So for me, it's one of these places that and subject matter that I find so stimulating because it keeps evolving, and there's so many different complexities to it that we still don't quite understand, although it's so essential for our survival and our livelihoods and for our world culture. So that's why it keeps me really engaged. Of what's something that seems so simple, just food and people consuming it, is so riddled with controversy and complexity.
Yeah, complexity, and yet a kind of simplicity that everyone has direct experience of it. It's something that everyone can understand from their own perspective.
Yeah.
And so we get to have these rich conversations with people from all walks of life about how our perception of the food system relates to theirs.
Yeah, I mean, so everyone's a nutrition expert because everyone eats.
There you go.
And particularly people in rural places. They really understand the connection with food.
Yeah. So maybe if we start there with the most extreme kinds of deprivation, can you give me a sense of how you see the progress we've made and the challenges, limitations of that progress? Do you feel like this has been, working in this domain for 20, 25 years, do you think that since the 1990s, broadly speaking, we've been succeeding, or maybe not so much? And then start at the bottom. And so maybe this conversation could move its way from the most severe deprivations and undernutrition through to the challenges of people at higher levels of income. But broadly speaking, one way of kind of framing the conversation is to say, are we succeeding? If so, where? Where are we not succeeding? Who is succeeding? What actors in the world food system are having, perhaps in your judgment, the greatest impacts and successes? The glass is always only partially full. I wouldn't expect complete success anywhere or complete failure, but how do you see the degree of progress on extreme undernutrition?
I mean, on undernutrition, and we're seeing declines in stunting, which is a marker for chronic undernourishment, height for age in a child under the age of 5. We've been seeing this slow, steady decline across many countries and many regions, but it's not fast enough. It's moving too slowly when you compare it to targets like the Sustainable Development Goal targets or World Health Assembly targets that mark the pace in which we should be decreasing across time. So to me, undernutrition is coming down, but slowly. But unfortunately, in certain other measures like undernourishment, which is tracked by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, hunger numbers are going up for the first time in 15 years. And they attribute that, they being FAO, attribute that to economic instability, climate change, shocks and conflicts that are arising in certain places. And we're now seeing some famines again rear their ugly head on the continent of Africa and Yemen. So while we're making progress in some places and some countries are moving much faster than others, we're seeing places that are stalled or things are reversing, which is really unfortunate. Where we're not succeeding is the overweight obesity agenda. The world is getting fatter. No country is able to really stop the trends, which is really alarming and has a whole other set of complications. But where when you start to look at a lot of the data disaggregation, Will, and this is kind of a question throw back at you, when you look at rural and urban, the rural are really being left behind. You still see really high prevalence of stunting and undernutrition in rural places compared to urban. And on the urban side, we're seeing the overweight obesity rise faster than we do in rural places, although they are not immune either. But you really, when you start to look at the disaggregated data across rural and urban, as well as other types of categorizations, it's quite distinct and shocking to see some of the rural figures or geographically isolated places in certain countries. And so the question is why? You know, why do we not care globally, politically, about rural people and places? You know, why, you know, Michael Lipton talked about this a long time ago. Why has there always been this urban bias? So what is making these rural places stagnant? And, you know, they have high burdens of undernutrition, which really does not help in their own development, their own transformation. They can't build the human capital they need to thrive. So my question to you is, what's happening in these rural places where they are being left behind and feeling disenfranchised from other places in the world?
Yeah, and that's the central, you know, question of this whole module, where the theme of the module is this idea of a rural population that's dispersed in space, where people have had to spread out in order to find the land that they can cultivate to feed their families. And rural population growth, with the shrinkage of the amount of land per household, determines how much production resource there is, and then technology, market access, and knowledge determines yield, productivity per unit of land. And so you get these very different experiences of people in very different rural areas where, as you said, even though on average stunting is falling because rural as well as urban people are able to meet both dietary and disease threats with a bit more income, but also more public services in some places. In other places, they don't get that at all, both entire countries and then some regions, even within countries that maybe succeed, you know, with the country as a whole maybe succeeding, but there are regions left behind. So I think it's helpful to sort of think of this rural level, and then urban areas are sort of taking off over here. And the rural people left behind are in a level of standard of living that may be falling if rural population growth is shrinking land per household, as it is across almost all of Africa today, unless countries are able to bring the new seeds, new technology, market access that would help them do more with their shrinking land area. And despite the shrinking land area per family, able to raise yields, raise market value of what they produce, and thereby buy what they can't produce to have the complete diet that one needs. All that in the context of, you know, the tremendous challenge of maternal empowerment and time use and capabilities to take care of adolescent girls pre-pregnancy, and then of course all the needs of gestation and early infancy, when it's not just food but a lot of care practices that require tremendous amounts of time and autonomy for a woman to provide to that infant. So those inputs are inputs to early infancy for stunting, and then all the other nutritional needs. But let's turn, if we can, to this this nutrition transition question. So as societies go from very, very poor, struggling to meet nutrient needs, even in rural areas, we're observing a very rapid shift in the composition of food, even for infants, towards things that have a wrapper, things that are packaged, things where we're not really sure what's in them. There may be trans fats that could be directly harmful, and there may be processed cereal grains and refined starches that are harmful. There may be other things that lead to cardiometabolic disease and other other harms. So can you give us a sense of the kind of global picture of trying to gain some mastery over this, I guess, jungle of foods that's kind of spreading out in a way that's gone almost uncontrolled by policy? Can you say a little bit about where we're at in managing the nutrition transition?
I mean, I don't think that much is being managed. I mean, you'll hear a bit around regulation from governments. I think a lot of those participating on the call heard a lot about soda tax as one way of regulating these processed packaged sugary foods and beverages and fat-laden beverages and foods. But it's not enough, clearly. I mean, I think there's a whole industry push because there's great economic gains to be made from a lot of these foods. But there's also the consumer side, right? So you've got the whole supply side of industry trying to deliver safe, and this depends on which kind of industry you're talking about, you know, regulated or unregulated, packaged foods. But there's the consumer side too of these foods are tasty, they're affordable, they're super convenient. So to go back, Will, to what you were saying about women's time and work burden, you go to Nepal, it's a lot easier to open some instant noodles than to spend 2 hours making dal bhat. Why? The instant noodles are cheap. They're really tasty, actually. I kind of like them. You can add the little spice packet to them. And they're really easy to make. It's 3 minutes. So this convenience, taste, and price that consumers are getting, it's very hard to then go back and say, well, you should go back to do your traditional ways of making food, and that sometimes the drudgery that's attached to that. And this is a bit unstoppable in a sense. We can't be paternalistic and tell people that well, America ate all those convenience foods and look what happened. You know, we're dying of non-communicable diseases and we're fat. Well, people have the right to choose what they want. And if that food is affordable for them and it's easy for them to get in their busy lives, it's really hard. So it's not just governments regulating industry, but there also needs to be a lot on consumer behavior and knowledge and awareness of what you're putting into your body, potential harms. So, you know, I don't think it's a simple answer for governments to start, you know, adding a tax to certain sodas or certain junk foods. I think it's going to take a very multi-pronged effort to really change these food environments, the places where consumers engage with the food system, make a decision about what to eat. And you see this, like you said, Will, you see it in rural places. It's not just urban anymore. You see little kiosks everywhere with candy jars in front and all the potato chips and crisps, right? Easily accessible. And then maybe you'll see a couple of bananas hanging up there. But yeah, it's a huge challenge.
Yeah, and I would like to turn to ideas, thoughts, questions that people online might have. But one observation regarding the rural presence of different kinds of foods is just the difference in infrastructure requirements for packaged foods versus fruits and vegetables, eggs, milk, and other components of a more nutritious diet. Is that, you know, those do require a public marketplace, perhaps with refrigeration, with light, with some sanitation, and that has to be supplied by local government. Plus you need infrastructure in between the marketplaces for people to be trading, you know, exchanging, moving around the eggs, the vegetables, the fruits, as well as dairy. And so unless that infrastructure is there, the non-perishable packaged foods
Absolutely.
become relatively much more accessible.
Yeah.
Even, something like crisps, potato chips, of course, a candy, hard candy, you can get that anywhere, as well as sodas, carbonated beverages. And the value of those treats in rural life is very important.
Yeah.
I've spent a lot of my early life, not so much now, but working in rural areas in pretty remote places, and it was really nice to have a soda.
Absolutely. It tastes pretty good, doesn't it? Yeah.
And so one wouldn't ever want to proceed by just brakes on that when we so much need accelerators on the fruits and vegetables, the dairy, the poultry, the eggs. Those need to be, and those do rely on public infrastructure to have a market.
And those need to be affordable.
Yeah.
So
good. So I do hope folks online are typing in questions, observations. One person noted just how time consuming it is to cook a good dal bhat.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it becomes the instant noodles or the dal bhat, right? 3 minutes, 2 hours. If a mother has time burdens and her children are hungry, it's easier to make those noodles. And it's really hard to argue with a mom when she's really constrained with time and work.
Yeah.
Yeah, the dal bhat is delicious.
But we have seen quite a lot of innovation in the space of trying to develop techniques that can equip families with ways of cooking and preparing healthy foods that are less time consuming than the traditional ones. So I think of all of the innovations around processing cassava in cassava growing areas that have made gari and cassava chips, dried cassava, something that's much more available, much less time consuming than cassava processing used to be. That's not a great example on the nutrition side. On the nutrition side, we'd be more interested in issues that make leguminous grains a little faster to prepare, because often anything that's a dal, a lentil, cowpeas, does have that added time cost for preparation. But also in terms of fruits and vegetables and making sure that those are accessible, available, as well as eggs and cheese, dairy products. So I'm interested in cities and towns. This whole module is about rural poverty and the extremes of deprivation that we see in rural areas, both nutritional and, but in what ways can towns help to, and the governance of towns and cities, help to make poverty history, help to either through linkages to the rural areas or through accommodation of migrants and so forth, be part of the solution rather than just a cesspool of poverty in themselves. Do you have observations on kind of this rural-urban linkage aspect of this module?
Well, I mean, yeah, I was thinking that, how do you bridge those rural-urban relationships where rural areas are still incredibly relevant for feeding urban populations? I mean, urban agriculture and urban self-sustaining cities I think we're still quite a long ways off, because even the built environment, the infrastructure in urban places can be quite dismal depending on where you are, and then other places incredibly innovative depending on what city you're in. So I think there's a lot, in places like New York, obviously very high income country, there's a nice relationship with the rural New York populations bringing food into farmers markets and city dwellers purchasing those foods, getting to know the farmers. In places more impoverished, like in Baltimore, there's a lot of populations that are sort of taking back their food spaces and their urban places, sort of a food justice approach. A lot of African American communities wanting to preserve the culture of their food and learning how to become peri-urban farmers in a sense. So, I mean, I think, Will, it's a hard question because, you know, very few people know where they get their food from anymore. You know, they don't know their farmer. They don't know their name. And it's a very kind of elite thing to do that in many high-income countries. In Nairobi, there was a great program where peri-urban women farmers were really supplying all the big nakumas, supermarkets, with the traditional leafy greens. And it became very in style again to the middle class Nairobi Kenyans to purchase those foods because they hadn't seen them since, you know, their grandmother cooked them for them, you know, years back. And that's a great case study of where peri-urban, not rural, but peri-urban women farmers were able to establish a market to get their fresh produce to large-scale supermarkets in Nairobi, and we're able to benefit from that from an income perspective. I love that story because it really, it is a real story. There is evidence of it, and they did improve their income, and they were producing fresh foods, leafy greens, very healthy and nutritious. But we need more stories like that. You know, you hear about this Kenyan leafy green story a lot. You don't hear a lot of success stories around this linkage with farmers feeding urban populations.
Yeah.
I don't know what you think.
No, I'm mostly curious about what people online are thinking, and so if you could type in observations, questions you might have. I'm particularly curious to know whether you are principally working at the most extreme levels of deprivation, concerned with adequacy in calories, adequacy in basic nutrients, whether you're concerned with, whether folks online are concerned primarily with sort of diet quality and undernutrition, meaning adequacy in terms of vitamin A or zinc or iron at certain times of life when people are most undernourished with respect to specific micronutrients, or whether people online are principally concerned about diet-related disease and the rise of the cardiometabolic conditions, the non-communicable chronic illness of combination of obesity, diabetes, hypertension, and so forth. So if you could give us a sense of what your priorities are, that would be super helpful, because it's so striking to me how the world has in some sense fragmented, with different places, different communities facing very different problems. To some degree, this has always been true, but maybe it's just true sort of unusually fast now, where societies are changing, and I could be working in one country, say, for example, Uganda, and in Uganda, I would have some communities that are in extreme deprivation, very close to very low levels of calories and protein malnutrition, and then others who are just having deficits of certain micronutrients, and others are having a struggle with obesity and diabetes and so forth. So very curious to get a sense of your priorities, what parts of countries, what parts of the world's food and nutrition challenges you're facing. So the first commenter, Anwari, notes that it does seem like, at least for him or her, the priority really is the greatest undernutrition, finding what he says, or she says, finding what to feed to people in the most remote rural areas. So talking about availability of healthier food in terms of addressing overnutrition, overconsumption is not the issue, but what to meet basic nutrient needs. Yeah, in terms of total numbers of people and the health burden of malnutrition, broadly speaking, not eating the right things, it does appear that the total disease burden of undernutrition is still greater than the lives and years lost to overconsumption, to obesity and diabetes and so forth. But that's mainly because it's the number of years, because the undernutrition happens early in life and affects in utero and then early infancy, and people do survive, but in a stunted and in a state where stunting and life course deficits limit the quality of life in a quite dramatic way. In contrast, overconsumption tends to have its greatest effects later in life, and on the quality of life, you know, at older ages. Of course, overconsumption is rising much faster than undernutrition. But do others online have a sense of their own priorities? So Anwari clearly focused on the undernutrition. Be very keen to hear about others. I find it very, I mean, I find the central challenge to be one of getting it right with regards to both problems. I don't feel a need to choose between them. I think this is a kind of challenge where it's like the Goldilocks story of things needing to be not too hot and not too cold, where we need to understand that a healthy diet is one that is protective against both under and over nutrition. We have an interesting comment from Abdurrahman Haji. It says, my country is investing in the green economy to ensure availability of healthy and sustainable diets for all people. What about other countries and international experiences concerning this relationship between the green economy, a more ecological, environmentally conscious approach to development generally, and healthy and sustainable diets? Jess, do you have a sense of the degree to which environmentalism and the nutrition community are working together, or are sometimes the two communities working at odds?
Yeah,
do you have a sense of how that's working out?
Yeah, and Abdurrahman, I think it's a great question. In a comment from you, it's great to hear your country is working on healthy and sustainable diets. I think some countries are taking leadership on this in this space more than others. I mean, Brazil is very concerned about this, and it reflects a bit in their food-based dietary guidelines. But I think there's other countries in which there's a real kind of separation between what is good for the planet and then what is good for human health. The United States really doesn't integrate sustainability issues in their food-based dietary guidelines as one example, and there's many other examples. And I think now there's a large debate in the global nutrition and climate community of, can we have both? Moving into the future, can we ensure that we have optimal human health coming from our diets and planetary health? And it's a big debate. It's a big question. And if we can't have both, what are the trade-offs that we're willing to live with? So I think there's a lot of countries grappling with this. You know, as demand for meat goes up, some meats being very resource intensive, like beef, and the appetite for that increasing, how do we balance that with some of the planetary constraints across land, water footprints, biodiversity loss, forest loss, and greenhouse gases? So this is a big question. And I think when you look at the climate agenda and the COP, the Convention of Parties meetings, there's talk about agriculture and the contribution of agriculture to greenhouse gases. But there's really not a lot thinking about what are the implications of the diets that we're eating on climate. We see it in the literature, but you don't really hear countries talking about, well, maybe people are consuming diets that have a big planetary footprint. So this is a debate that continues, and I don't think a lot of countries, unfortunately, have really wrapped their head around this whole space of healthy and sustainable diets yet. And there's a lot of talk about metrics and how do you measure sustainable diets and what do they look like in specific countries, because they're very different wherever you go. So I think there's still a lot of debate on identifying and measuring what a sustainable diet looks like in country X or Y.
Yeah, yeah. And a participant has characterized this very, very well. Deborah O'Connor writes, the real cost of food is a good way of looking at this. She writes, the real cost of food is not taken into consideration. Cheap foods, detrimental to the environment and society, end up costing other people. You know, you buy them, don't pay much, but others incur the cost of ill health as well as environmental damage. And Lucia Segovia writes, how to know what is the healthiest and most sustainable diet. This question of metrics that Jess, you just mentioned. Do you have a sense of best sources? Like, how should one begin? You know, imagine that you're in an advocacy position or just thinking about one's own choices. What would be the right way to think about guidance away from market prices, which, as the previous comment noted, often are misleading, towards signals that would take the long run into account, take other people into account, and make choices that are healthy as well as sustainable? What are the right sources of data for that?
I don't think they've really hit the consumer, you know, wide public level, with the exception of maybe some of you have seen fish charts. So when you go to the grocery store, the supermarket, or your local market, sometimes you'll see a sustainable fish chart, and it tells you which fish are less sustainable to eat or more sustainable, you know, higher on the food chain versus lower on the food chain, and what are some of the health benefits of those. It's like a scorecard for seafood. That's one thing that's been done that's very helpful for consumers. But and you read a little bit in newspapers, and obviously the scientific literature is filled with this, of the footprints of a kilogram of beef versus a kilogram of chicken versus a kilogram of lamb. You can look across a suite of indicators in the environment and see which has the biggest impact on water and land and greenhouse gases. But to pull it all together around what's the healthiest and what's the most environmentally sustainable, we being the royal scientific we, haven't really come up with a user-friendly way for people to be able to make choices around what's healthy and sustainable. Ironically, there's still a lot of debate about what is a healthy diet. There's a lot of debate amongst the world's experts on diets around what is healthy. So the scientists have to get their act together and start taking some of the evidence and putting it into usable information streams for consumers, because right now it's very confusing for the consumer to know what to eat. I'm confused, and I know the literature more than other people. So, and on the price point from Deborah, just one quick thing. Deborah will get a kick out of this. I was at a restaurant in Washington, D.C., and they had a hamburger on the menu, so beef patty. And then on the menu, they had something called the Impossible Burger, which is made from plant-based protein, and it's made with beetroot. So it bleeds like meat, it looks like meat, it smells like meat, and it tastes like meat, but it's not meat. And the regular beef patty was $10 on the menu, and the Impossible Burger was $15. You know that the beef patty probably cost a lot more to make when you take into account the true costs of that beef patty. But the veggie burger was, 50% more in price. So it's a great example of what Deborah was talking about.
And it links very nicely to two comments that just came through. Vijay Obayashi and also Emma Willenborg have written notes that are actually in parallel to each other. So Vijay writes, what about using the markets and disincentivizing consumption of unhealthy foods through taxes? And Emma says, well, also, what about incentivizing local or nutritious foods, such as with mechanisms like cash transfers and subsidies? Jess, what do you think is the track record of using prices as an incentive as opposed to using behavior change communication type mechanisms, as opposed to using direct regulation? Where do we stand on the different tools to move diets in a healthier, more sustainable direction?
I mean, this is probably more your space, Will, but my very naive perspective is that it's too early with taxes. And I think you have to be careful with taxes, and that sugar tax, a soda tax, not so beneficial for the human population in general, right? There's no ethical dilemma. Whereas if you start taxing certain foods because they are carbon intensive, like meat, you could get into some ethical issues in dinging the poor. It could be really making some foods that could be important for nutrition and health more expensive for the poor. So I think the tax debate jury is out to me. Mexico has put in a soda tax. They've seen about an 8% reduction in purchases. Whether that will make a dent in the significant obesity epidemic in Mexico, probably not. You're going to need a lot more different tools in the toolbox. On the incentivizing, well, I mean, there's other ways too, right? Mass media campaigns, some have worked well, Emma and Vijay, some have not. So the public health campaigns, some have been incredibly effective and some don't. But a lot of people use the cigarettes as an example that you could compare to food. You know, taxing cigarettes became one way of tampering down smoking, along with a lot of other things, public health campaigns, making it very difficult to smoke anywhere, you know, so it's stigmatizing it. So it took multiple efforts to see smoking come down in some places like the United States. On the incentivizing, I'm less clear. Maybe, Will, you have thoughts on that, of subsidizing healthy foods through agriculture policies or trade policies. This is a place where I'm less clear on. It'd be great to get your thoughts on.
Yeah, I mean, I think the record is that overall price, people will substitute very easily within categories. If, let's say, among green leafy vegetables, if the price of pumpkin leaves goes down and the price of amaranth leaf goes up and the price of kale goes, you know, people will substitute from one to the other. But if the prices of all vegetables go up, consumption of all vegetables is less likely to respond. So subsidies for the whole category are less effective than one might think from the evidence about individual foods. And what we've, I think, found is that, first of all, the market infrastructure is tremendously influential in the time cost and availability of food. So especially if we think about diets of the poorest in remote locations where seasonality is a big issue, infrastructure plays a huge role in ensuring year-round access. Way above prices is just, are foods there? Are they there around the year? Are they available at reasonably low time cost? And then there's the monetary cost as well. So I think infrastructure and just our markets built by local governments and maintained in a competitive, efficient way so that people can, fairly close to where they live, find a complete diet. That's step one, and then prices and behavior, communication, mass media, and so forth, and regulation all play a role. And a very interesting observation from Simon Petley, who writes, in mid and higher income countries, farmers, for example, beef producers in Brazil, are politically powerful, and their interests often drive the agenda. This gets right back to what Jess raised earlier about urban bias in the poorest places, shifting to pro-farmer bias in richer places. At the level of income of Brazil or China today, farmers begin to have more influence and gain the subsidies at the expense of consumers, whereas in poorer countries, much of Africa today, farmers are still, rural people are still net payers in terms of how taxes and trade restrictions influence prices that people pay. This plays a big role, the political shift from urban bias in poor countries to pro-farmer bias in the examples that Simon Petley just raised about beef producers in Brazil who, would choose certain policies and often get what they want. On the other, different parts of the farm community have very different kinds of influence. In the United States, for example, fruit and vegetable growers have very little influence, whereas the main commodity crop growers have a lot of influence. So that's a great observation. I think everybody in their different political settings has opportunities to recognize where one lobbying group is wielding outsized power, often at the expense of the food system, and it's important to advocate and understand and recognize and use some transparency, some recognition that because victories are in the public interest against entrenched interests are surprisingly possible. So the United States today, as I hope everyone on the line is very, very keenly aware, the United States is in a very perilous political time with a lot of great danger, and yet some good things do happen. We just have pushed through a restaurant disclosure menu labeling rule, which previously people had thought might not happen because of the new administration in Washington, but they did go ahead with it, and so there are, it is possible, even though often political situations seem dire and very, very difficult, even on the worst of circumstances, good things can happen. Ulrika asks, how should we educate producers and consumers to understand the importance of sustainable diets and actually convince them to put into action? So what are the arguments? What are the sort of observations that can be most influential? That's a great question, Ulrika. Jess, you've been in the advocacy business for a long time, thinking about science.
This is
doing the Global Nutrition Report.
Yeah.
Doing, finding ways to craft the message. Let's think specifically about the Global Nutrition Report. What are the ways of framing that you found most successful?
I think, the Global Nutrition Report is all about accountability. Those who are responsible for generating data, ensuring they're accountable for producing the best data and sharing that data. Policymakers who are making decisions about nutrition policies and diet and agriculture policies, food-based dietary guidelines, ensuring they're accountable to addressing the needs of all their citizens, right? So you can go on and on of different actors. It's hard to know, Will, what's been successful for the Global Nutrition Report because it's a report, right? It's a here's the report, and it just that's what it is, right? It's the aftermath that follows from that when we have launches in countries where countries take up the findings of the report and apply it to their country context, and have policymakers sitting at the table and arguing that they need to invest in nutrition. When you get down to the consumer producer level, the two bookends of the food system, it gets a bit more sticky because people don't live in sectors, or they don't live in systems. They live their lives and they have to make lots of choices every day. And so what works to shift behavior for consumers or producers? To me, from a consumer, and we're all consumers, we're citizens that eat food, I think there's really two things. I think there's been incredible campaigns that have shifted agendas and nationwide consumers. Some of you probably don't know this, but Will and I will remember this. There was this very profound commercial of a Native American who's looking out over a river, and he's crying because he's looking at all the pollution, the rubbish all over his land. And this was in the, I think, Will, when was this? The 70s, maybe the 80s? And it was such an impactful commercial. And there's been studies showing this, that people littering, throwing rubbish out their cars, or, you know, not picking up after themselves, dramatically went down from that commercial. And now it's strange to see people littering on the street in the United States. You take notice of it, you're like, did that person just throw that on the sidewalk? You're always a little bit shocked by it. There's been other public health campaigns like that around seatbelts. We need more of those for consumers. And what I think really impacts people is when it's personal. So you're an African American, your mom has had her leg amputated because she's a diabetic. That hits home pretty significantly. You might start thinking about your family's diet when your mother has lost her leg from diabetes. It's these kind of personal, visceral responses, I think, that really can be really marked changes in how consumers think about things. We need more of those in nutrition. On the producer side, I think we have to think of producers as entrepreneurs. They own a business. That business needs to thrive. They want to pass that business on to either their family, or they want it to grow. And so when you start to think about sustainability issues, I think it really resonates with a lot of farmers, because they know that if their land becomes degraded over time, they won't have a business anymore. So there's an economic and business model that and case to be made with sustainability. And I think more and more producers and industry are factoring in sustainability issues into their business models, because they have to. They don't really have a choice anymore. They're a bit on their knees as to what to do. So I don't know, Will, if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the point you just made about having messages which are personal is really profound. And I think also there's a question of having messages that are very specific and get right to the heart of it. We need to understand the problem well enough to be able to frame something quite specific and narrow. So in terms of diet quality, we're sort of getting there where at low incomes for nutrition, diet diversity is really central. And so simply having enough different food groups in the diet available year round in very low income rural settings can often be the crucial way to describe what's needed. Simply get up to 5 or more food groups when you define food groups in terms of their nutritional function, and you will be likely to meet your micronutrient needs. When people are at risk of obesity, diabetes, diet diversity becomes actually associated with bad outcomes. People eat too many different things, and they eat too much of harmful things. And so we need different messages. What kinds of simple messages like don't litter, don't smoke can work for food. We're not there yet. As Jess said earlier, I completely agree that we're still trying to find the messages. A famous American writer, Michael Pollan, said, eat real food, mostly plants, not too much. And the idea of increasing the amount of plant-based food in your diet, moving towards more fruits and vegetables, more leguminous grains, but then also more whole grains, and then less saturated fat and no trans fats at all, less sodium. At that point, it's awfully complicated. And so we need to keep refining those messages. And I think it's up to everyone in their local community, in their local environment, to think what is the right way to address that question that Erika asked. You know, what's the right way to convince people? Well, that's going to depend on which people and what your specific place is. So we have more. We have just five minutes left for this conversation. It's been super interesting so far, and I guess we can return to the original framing of this whole hour-long conversation, which is: are healthier, more sustainable diets within reach? How far do we have to reach out to get to a better food system in terms of both sustainability and health? So, Jess, any final words and about that question of what's close and what's farther?
Hypothetically, yes, but it'll take disruptive, radical political transformation. I mean, we need policymakers to take bold steps around climate. We need consumers to realize, particularly in high-income countries, that they don't need to eat so much meat. It's actually not so healthy for them, right? This idea of self-liberties, of don't tell me what I should eat and what I shouldn't eat. Well, if the societal costs are so high on healthcare costs and environmental costs, maybe people should be thinking themselves as global citizens, and that what they do eat does matter. And they may be fine because they are sitting in their big house and eating their beef patties every day, but others will suffer. Others will suffer the consequences that can't adapt so quickly to the changes that will come. So to me, I'm a cautious optimist, because I feel that we need real thoughtful, sustained political action. And I think all of you know that the world is fractured right now politically. It's not just the United States, it's the European Union, it's countries in Africa, there's countries in Asia. We have a lot of issues to deal with, and we need to work collectively, because our food system is very globalized now, and what we do eat matters. It matters around the world, the choices we make. So to me, we really have to rise up as consumers and shift the way supply is being, the way the food supply is being shaped, and use your power of the vote to really make the change you want to see, because the world is at a crossroads. We've got a few ways to go, and one of those can be a very detrimental path for not only humanity but all the species living on the planet. And if it doesn't go that way, it's an incredibly sad story. It's a bit like the Roman Empire. I'm sitting in Rome right now. It's a bit of like the Roman Empire kind of feel to it. But I think that there's also at the same time an incredible recognition that the policy processes aren't working, and consumers are standing up and wanting a better food system, wanting a more just food system, wanting to eat healthier, realizing that it's not only humans sitting on this planet, it's a lot of other creatures that matter. We want to keep it that way. So I think there's becoming a real awareness around the issues as well. So I have hope in the citizens of the world that are making changes in lots of countries now and rising up and having their voice heard.
Yeah, and that's a great place to end this. I think we've got examples of success in many, many countries, as the Global Nutrition Report documents, opportunities in others, you know, much, much, much more challenging. So thanks to everyone for participating. We'll continue this conversation in the discussion forums in the course itself, and of course, also outside the course, lots and lots of work to do. This conversation with Jess has been really terrific. Thanks to everybody for participating. Thanks to the SDG Academy for organizing. I think this course has been really nice, and these discussions are a big, really good feature of it. Thanks again.